In the quiet shadow of the 9th century, when Europe lay fractured and war-torn, the city of Rome stood not as the noble center of the ancient empire it once commanded, but as a haunted ruin, smothered in ivy and intrigue. Within its decaying marble halls and candlelit chapels, a storm of corruption stirred, not from invading armies, but from within the heart of Christendom itself. This was the beginning of what historians later called the Saeculum Obscurum, the dark age of the papacy, a time when popes were not saints but pawns, or worse, predators. Let us begin not with a living pope, but with a dead one. It was the winter of 897 AD. A bitter wind howled through the crooked alleys of Rome, rattling wooden shutters and echoing off the broken columns of forgotten temples. Inside the Basilica of St. John Lateran, the grandest church of the time, a strange and dreadful trial was about to unfold. A corpse had been exhumed from its grave. The body was once Pope Formosus. He had died months earlier, quietly, with scandal behind him and judgment left to God. But the new Pope, Stephen VI, was not content with divine justice. He wanted spectacle. He wanted revenge. Formosus's decomposing remains were dressed in papal vestments and propped upright on a throne, his skull grinning silently beneath a crown of rot. Before him stood a council of cardinals, bishops, and nobles. This was no vision. This was real. A cadaver signed, a trial of a corpse. With a trembling voice that echoed in the vaulted church, Pope Stephen pointed his finger and accused the dead pope of perjury, of ambition, of unholy lust for power. A deacon stood beside the body and answered the questions on behalf of the corpse, mumbling replies to satisfy the absurd ritual. Witnesses gasped, some wept, others laughed nervously. And when it was done, when the sentence was pronounced, Formosus was stripped of his papal robes, 3 fingers of blessing were cut from his withered hand, and his body was thrown into the river Tiber. For weeks, the people of Rome whispered of curses and ghosts. A flood soon followed, and when Formosus's body washed up on the riverbank, believers claimed miracles were seen in its presence. The people turned against Pope Stephen. He would not last the year. He was arrested, imprisoned, and strangled in the very cell that had once held those he condemned. But the madness did not end there. In the decades that followed, the papacy became a chessboard for Rome's noble families. Popes came and went, some elected as teenagers, some bribed into power, others murdered in their sleep. The throne of St. Peter was no longer sacred, it was a prize. Formosus's ghost, some said, never left the Lateran. The cadaver signed was not merely a grotesque moment in church history. It was a mirror, revealing the chaos that brewed as the 10th century dawned. The holy city of Rome found itself not led by the virtuous, but by the very young, and not innocent young, but dangerously entitled. Among the most infamous of these papal prodigies was John XII, a pope crowned not by merit or calling, but by family ambition. He became the Bishop of Rome at the tender age of 16. Imagine, if you will, a teenager handed the keys to the most powerful office in Christendom. No mentors, no guidance, just wealth, influence, and the freedom to do whatever he pleased. His real name was Octavian. Born into the ruling Roman aristocracy, he was the son of Alberic II, a man who controlled Rome like a personal fiefdom. When Alberic lay on his deathbed, he made the Roman nobles swear that his son would become pope, and so they did. Octavian took the papal name John XII. But he did not act like a shepherd of souls. He was more like a reckless prince. Soon the Lateran Palace, once a center of piety, was turned into a place of feasts, gambling, and whispered sins. Concubines were seen entering through secret doors. Gold chalices were used not for mass, but for wine-soaked revelry. Some claimed he invoked pagan gods during drunken rites, and there were darker rumors of assaults, of bribes, even of murder. In 963, his enemies had had enough. The Holy Roman Emperor Otto I marched into Rome and held a synod. Yes, another trial of a pope. John XII was accused of blasphemy, perjury, adultery, and turning the papal palace into, as the records say, a brothel. But before they could arrest him, John fled the city. He returned later under shadow, only to die not long after, mysteriously, at just 27 years old. Some said he was murdered by a jealous husband. Others whispered that the devil himself had come to collect. Brief pause. The fire crackles softly. Wind outside stirs the curtains of memory. But if John the XII was a scandal, then Benedict the IX was a calamity. He too became pope at a shockingly young age, perhaps as young as 11. His papacy stretched over decades, not continuously, but in fragments, because Benedict sold the papacy. Twice. Yes, you heard that right. He sold the papacy. According to the chronicler Rodolphus Glaber, Benedict lived in such open wickedness that the people of Rome finally rose against him. At one point, in 1045, he actually resigned the papal throne so that he could marry, but not before selling the papacy to his godfather, Gregory VI, for a small fortune. Then, once the marriage didn't happen, Benedict returned and tried to reclaim the papacy for himself. Imagine a man auctioning off the keys of St. Peter like a title deed, only to snatch it back when his personal plans unraveled. By the mid-11th century, the papacy was no longer just in spiritual danger. It was in existential crisis. Popes were children, criminals, and kings. The church trembled, not from heresy or invasion, but from within. The Lateran Palace had become a haunted symbol. The golden crosses no longer gleamed as they once did. The altars bore silent witness to secrets too dark to be spoken. And yet, through it all, the faith of the common people endured. Somehow, they believed. As the 11th century faded and the 12th arrived, the seat of St. Peter found itself under siege. Not from foreign armies, but from men in robes who claimed to be popes, though the world was never quite sure if they truly were. These were the anti-popes. And oh, dear listener, there were many. You see, during times of division, when politics intertwined with faith, rival factions began to elect competing popes, each claiming to be the one true voice of God on earth. Sometimes it was due to influence from kings or emperors. Other times it was powerful Roman families trying to push their own candidate. And so, for the first time in history, the church had not one pope, but two, and sometimes more. Let us drift now to the heart of this confusion. The year was 1130. Pope Honorius II had died suddenly. A rushed election was held, but it was no ordinary vote. Two rival factions of cardinals, each meeting separately, each under the weight of noble pressure, both elected different men as pope. In one corner, Innocent II, a reformer, quiet, intelligent. In the other, Anacletus II, backed by the powerful Pierleone family of Rome. Both men were crowned, both issued bulls, both claimed the chair of Peter, and Christendom was divided. France, England, and Germany recognized Innocent. Scotland, Sicily, and much of Rome followed Anacletus. Cathedrals split loyalties. Monasteries fell into chaos. Pilgrims arrived in Rome, unsure whose blessing to seek. Was it Innocent or Anacletus? The papacy had become not one holy voice, but a chorus of confusion. Brief pause. The sound of a distant storm rumbles, like history groaning. But the greatest anti-pope drama was still to come. Fast forward to the 14th century, to a time now known as the Western Schism. It all began with a crisis in Avignon, where the papacy had been residing for decades, far from Rome, nestled in the lavender-scented fields of southern France. When the papacy finally returned to Rome in 1377, chaos followed. Riots broke out. The newly elected pope, Urban VI, quickly turned paranoid and vengeful. Many cardinals claimed they had been forced to vote for him under threat of violence, so they fled Rome and declared his election invalid. They then elected a rival pope, Clement VII, who returned to Avignon. Thus began the Great Divide, Urban in Rome, Clement in Avignon. 2 popes, 2 courts, 2 sets of bishops, each excommunicated the other. And as the decades passed, the madness grew. Universities argued, kings chose sides, monasteries were torn, and faithful peasants, the ones who needed guidance the most, could only stare up at the heavens and wonder, who speaks for God? But instead of resolution, the church now had 3 rival popes, 3 men in white robes, 3 voices shouting over one another in Latin. It would take until 1417, nearly 40 years after the split began, before a great council in Constance finally ended the madness. The other claimants were exiled, and a new pope, Martin V, was crowned, bringing unity. At last. The era of anti-popes left deep scars. It taught the world that even the holiest of thrones could become a battlefield. For a time, the voice of God had been drowned out by politics, vanity, and fear. And yet, as ever, the candle in the chapel still burned, faint, flickering, but alive. The year is 897. Rome is not the Renaissance marvel it will someday become. No, it is a city of rubble and rival warlords, plagued by floods, famine, and fear. But in the midst of this chaos, the papacy decides to make history in a way no one ever expected. That history would come to be known as the Cadaver Synod. Let us slowly light the candle and step into this grim, surreal chamber of scandal. It begins with a pope named Formosus. During his reign, Pope Formosus made many enemies. He had supported a political figure who fell out of favor. He had crowned emperors who later turned against Rome. And after his death, his rivals were not content to let him rest in peace. His body was exhumed. Yes, dear listener. 9 months after his death, his decaying corpse was removed from its tomb, dressed in papal robes, seated upon a throne in the Lateran Basilica, and placed on trial. His shriveled fingers were still clad in rings, his skull tilted to one side. His flesh had darkened and stiffened. And yet, bishops gathered, solemn and serious, to pass judgment on a man who could not answer. The presiding pope, Stephen VI, had personal hatred for Formosus. He believed the man had committed grave sins against the church, sins of ambition, of deceit, and of unlawful power. So he arranged this macabre courtroom. A deacon was appointed to speak on behalf of the corpse, like a ventriloquist of justice. Questions were asked, accusations were hurled, and silence met them all, for the defendant was no longer alive. But still, the verdict came. Guilty. The dead pope was found guilty of violating canon law, of illegitimately holding office, and of betraying the church. And then, the punishment. His papal garments were stripped. The 3 fingers he had used to bless the faithful were cut off. His body was dragged through the streets of Rome and dumped into the Tiber River like a sack of sin. Pause. Let the listener feel the eerie stillness of it all. But Rome, like the Tiber, never stands still. Soon after the Cadaver Synod, Pope Stephen VI was overthrown, imprisoned, and later strangled in his cell. The man who had tried a corpse was now a corpse himself. And in a strange twist of justice, Pope Formosus's body was recovered from the river and buried again, this time with honor. Later popes annulled the Cadaver Synod, calling it what it was, a grotesque, politically fueled farce. Yet the image remained. A dead man, propped up on a throne, judged by the living. A papal courtroom that looked more like a crypt. What did the people of Rome think as they heard of this trial? Or did they simply bow their heads and carry on? Such was the strange, spiraling world of the medieval church. A world where sainthood and scandal slept in the same bed, where the bones of the past were never truly at rest. The vow of celibacy, a pillar of the church, a sacred promise. For centuries, popes were expected to be married not to a woman, but to God. But behind closed doors, history has a habit of blushing. You see, there was a time, especially during the Middle Ages and the Renaissance, when the papacy was not just a seat of spiritual guidance, but a throne of very human appetites. And some popes did not abstain. Let us begin with Pope Alexander VI, born Rodrigo Borgia. Ah, the Borgias. If you've heard the name, you know the scent of scandal clings to it like incense to velvet. Rodrigo Borgia had children, not rumors, actual documented children. Among them, Cesare and Lucrezia, names that would one day echo in both fear and fascination across Europe. He was already a cardinal when he took a mistress, Vanozza de Catani, and with her had 4 children. Later, he was said to take another mistress, a much younger woman, Giulia Farnese, known as Giulia la Bella. Giulia lived in the Vatican itself, so close to the papal chambers that some jested she had her own secret door. And while Rodrigo was pope, Giulia's brother would rise in power, becoming Cardinal Alessandro Farnese, and eventually Pope Paul III. Favoritism, perhaps, but no one questioned it too loudly, not when the Borgias ruled. Pause. The tone softens, curious and dreamlike. Now drift with me to the tale of Pope Julius II, sometimes called the warrior pope. He was more at home in armor than in robes, and his reputation for women and wine was whispered through the streets of Rome. But it wasn't just women. Whispers suggest that Julius, like several other Renaissance-era popes, may have enjoyed the company of young men as well. Handsome artists and attendants who passed through the papal palaces. The Vatican of this era was a stage, and behind the curtains, the actors played many roles. But perhaps the most shocking of all were not just the affairs, but the children of popes who rose to power. Did you know that several popes openly acknowledged their children? They were granted titles, lands, and positions within the church. Some became bishops before they were even old enough to speak Latin fluently. Celibacy was not enforced seriously until later centuries. In the early and high Middle Ages, many priests and even bishops had wives or concubines. It wasn't unusual. It was just unspoken. The church turned a blind eye until it could no longer afford to. Music softens into the sound of faint laughter, doors creaking shut, and muffled whispers. So what did the common faithful think? Some were scandalized, but many were not, because they too lived in a world where ideals and reality rarely held hands. They confessed, they prayed, they believed, and they accepted that even popes were made of flesh. And yet, these scandals, these very human missteps. Tonight, as you rest your eyes, consider this. In the most sacred halls of power, behind marble walls and beneath painted ceilings, even the holiest men often fell prey to the most ancient of temptations. Not all the struggles within the Vatican were of the flesh. Some were spiritual battles, not political intrigue, not romantic scandal, but literal confrontations with the forces of darkness. Let us begin with a strange tale. In the 11th century, a pope, Pope Sylvester II, was whispered to have made a pact with the devil. This pope, born Gerbert of Aurillac, was a brilliant scholar, a mathematician, a man of science, but that, in itself, was suspicious to many. For how else could one man possess such arcane knowledge unless he had help from below? Whispers claimed he owned a talking bronze head, a kind of early artificial intelligence that could answer any question. Some said it told him when he would die, and when his time came, Pope Sylvester II demanded that his body not be buried in St. Peter's Basilica. He feared his remains would disturb the sacred ground. Still today, a legend says, when his tomb sweats, a pope will die within the year. Now let us drift further into the mist, to the tale of Pope Innocent VIII. He ruled during a time when witchcraft trials were rising. Fear of the occult was sweeping across Europe. Innocent did not merely oversee these fears, he fueled them. In 1484, he issued a papal bull that effectively gave birth to the infamous witch-hunting manual, Malleus Maleficarum, or the Hammer of Witches. He declared that witches were real, their heresy dangerous, and their curses powerful. This wasn't just church policy, it was a spiritual declaration of war. He helped set the stage for a century of inquisitions, torture, and burning stakes. Yet, ironically, Pope Innocent himself was said to have suffered a curse at the end of his life. He fell into a coma and, according to legend, his doctors attempted to revive him with the blood of 3 young boys. A ghastly, desperate act that reportedly failed. Fact or fable? Hard to say, but history remembers. Then there's Pope Leo XIII, the 19th century pontiff, known for a curious moment of divine terror. It is said that after celebrating Mass, Leo froze, his eyes locked into space. He claimed to hear a conversation between God and Satan. Satan, he said, had been granted 100 years to test the church, an ominous deal reminiscent of the Book of Job. Shaken, Leo returned to his quarters and immediately composed a powerful prayer, the St. Michael exorcism. So feared was this prayer that it was banned from public liturgy decades later, seen as too strong, too grim, too unsettling for the average parishioner. But the Vatican still uses it, quietly, behind closed doors. Now the music grows fainter, eerie, like wind curling through stone halls. But were the popes themselves ever possessed? No confirmed case, but exorcists within the Vatican have reported dark forces interfering during papal rituals. Objects moving. Even today, the Vatican employs official exorcists. Their number? Confidential. Their identities? Protected. They train, pray, and prepare for war, not with men, but with spirits. So as you lie still tonight, remember, while most of us battle our demons in dreams, some once battled them in reality. And not just any men. Popes. Not all papal scandals involved whispering lips or ink on parchment. Some were more immediate, more physical. Let us wander into the kitchens and banquet halls of the Vatican, where robes brushed against velvet tablecloths and golden goblets shimmered, sometimes laced with death. Yes, this was the era of poison, the invisible dagger, the silent assassin, the most refined tool of removal among cardinals, nobles, and even popes. We begin with Pope Alexander VI, a name soaked in both power and scandal. Born Rodrigo Borgia, he was the very embodiment of Renaissance excess. During his papacy, it was rumored that he and his son, Cesare Borgia, developed a fondness for a mysterious white powder known as cantarella. Its origin? Unknown. Its effect? Lethal. They allegedly used it to remove enemies, even rivals in the church. How? Through banquets. The Borgias were said to throw grand feasts, invite influential cardinals or noblemen, and, should the mood strike, ensure the wine flowed with a little something extra. Some whispered that Cesare carried a ring with a hidden compartment. Just a twist and a few grains could slip into a goblet unnoticed. And so, over music and laughter, under the chandeliers of the Vatican's great dining halls, men would drink toasts to friendship and fall dead before dessert. But in a twist of dark irony, it may have been Pope Alexander VI himself who fell victim to poison. One evening, the story goes, a feast was prepared. Cesare and the Pope had a particular target in mind, but the dishes were accidentally swapped. The Pope consumed the fatal portion. He died after days of agony, his body reportedly bloated and blackened, described by one observer as a rotting gourd. Even in death, the Borgia legacy lingered and reeked. Yet he was not alone. In the early 1600s, Pope Clement VIII reportedly died from a cup of hot chocolate. Now, you may think that an innocent thing, but in those days, chocolate was new to Europe, imported from the Americas and believed by some to be exotic, even dangerous. Some claimed that chocolate could hide the taste of bitter toxins. The Vatican investigated. Whispers flew. Was it a plot, a coincidence, or simply an old man meeting his fate? We may never know. But the idea that a cup of chocolate could kill a pope was enough to spark fear and suspicion for decades. Another dark tale takes us to Pope Pius III, who reigned for a mere 26 days in 1503. He was elected as a compromise, an old man meant to be a bridge between rival factions, but no sooner had he taken the papal throne than he fell mysteriously ill. His death? Sudden, unexpected, too convenient for some. Speculation pointed to poison. He had eaten with cardinals just days before. No investigation was... Yes, one man, trusted above all others, whose only job was to taste the Pope's food before he dined. If he lived, the meal continued. If not, well, the problem solved itself. Even today, popes are rarely seen drinking wine in public, and all meals during major ceremonies are prepared under strict supervision, often by nuns or longtime clergy. Because in a city where secrets can be deadly, the spoon may be as dangerous as the sword. So tonight, as you drift to sleep, imagine the banquet halls now silent. The silverware gleams, the wine glistens, and somewhere, far beneath the marble and gold, the truth still waits in the shadows of the kitchen. Once upon a time, to read the wrong book could damn your soul, and worse, your body. The Church, the guardian of divine truth, knew the power of the written word, and it feared it. So it created a list, a long, ever-growing list, the Index Librorum Prohibitorum, the Index of Forbidden Books, a catalog of danger, of thoughts too sharp, too questioning, too modern, books that challenged the Church's authority, its doctrine, its worldview, books that had to be silenced. But it began before the Index, long before. Let us wander back to the 4th century, when the Christian world was fractured by heresies. One bishop would argue that Christ was divine, another that he was merely human. Debates grew heated. Manuscripts were copied, smuggled, debated in secret chambers. And as the Church grew more organized, it began to fight not with words, but with fire. By the Middle Ages, heretical texts were being burned in town squares. Monks copied the Bible by hand, but any commentary not sanctioned by Rome was destroyed. Enter the Renaissance. With it came a terrifying invention for the papacy, the printing press. Suddenly, anyone could print their thoughts, their doubts, their revolutions. And so came men like Martin Luther, who nailed his 95 Theses to a church door and triggered an earthquake across Europe. The Church responded not just with counter-arguments, but with the Index. Galileo Galilei, the famed astronomer, found his works banned. Why? Because he dared to say that the Earth, God's own footstool, moved around the sun. It contradicted Scripture. It challenged centuries of belief. And so, he was placed under house arrest, his book banned, and his name whispered in shame. For a time. Even the philosopher Descartes, with his famous line, "I think, therefore I am," feared publishing. He delayed his greatest work because of what had happened to Galileo. The Index grew. At its peak, it listed over 4,000 titles, some by known heretics, others by scientists, artists, even saints. It was illegal in many Catholic countries to own, read, or distribute any book on the list. And yet, many still did. Books were smuggled into cities in barrels, wrapped in cloth, hidden beneath fish. Priests read them in secret. Cardinals debated them behind locked doors, because ideas, once written, cannot be easily killed. What of the Vatican Library itself? It houses more than 1 million books, including manuscripts that the public may never see. Some say there are books there no one has read for centuries, so fragile that even breathing near them could make them disintegrate. What do they say? We may never know. Perhaps lost gospels, secret histories, or truths too powerful or too damning to share. In 1966, under Pope Paul VI, the Index was officially abolished. But even so tonight, as the pages turn slowly in your dreams, remember, It is not just swords or poisons that have shaken the Vatican, but words, ink, and the human mind's endless hunger to question. To the faithful, a saint's body is more than just remains. It is relic, testimony, a fragment of the divine. But what happens when those bones go missing, or multiply, or turn up in places they were never meant to be? This is the strange, sleepy tale of how the Church came to be both guardian and trader of holy skeletons, and how relics, both real and imagined, built cathedrals and empires. Let us begin with St. Peter, the rock upon which the Church was built. His remains are believed to lie beneath St. Peter's Basilica in Rome. In the 1940s, Vatican archaeologists unearthed ancient bones beneath the altar, a hidden burial chamber. Tests suggested they belonged to a robust man in his 60s, no name carved, but wrapped in rich purple cloth with gold thread. Was it Peter? The Church cautiously said, yes, but the full truth, as always, buried deeper still. Now consider St. Catherine of Siena. When she died in Rome, the people of Siena wanted her body returned to her hometown, but the authorities refused. So, local devotees stole her head, yes, her actual head, and smuggled it out of the city in a paper bag. They were caught at the gate, but when questioned, the bag allegedly miraculously transformed, appearing to contain nothing but rose petals. The head made it to Siena, where it still rests in a gilded reliquary. Her body remains in Rome, her foot in Venice. Such is the life of a saint. During the Middle Ages, relics became spiritual currency. Every church wanted them. Every town needed them. A bone of St. Thomas, a hair from Mary Magdalene, a tooth of John the Baptist. Pilgrims would travel for weeks to gaze upon them. Touching a relic was said to cure disease, absolve sins, or grant fertility. Cathedrals rose around fragments of bone and scraps of cloth. And with such demand came supply. Yes, relic forgery was big business. Some merchants sold goat bones as those of martyrs. Others claimed to possess the milk of the Virgin Mary, or the foreskin of Christ. Multiple versions of it, in fact, across Europe. So common was this confusion that Erasmus, the humanist scholar, once joked, "I have seen in various places enough pieces of the true cross to build a ship." The Church, aware of the scandal, began regulating relics. Bishops had to verify authenticity, and documents of origin were required. But still, the relics multiplied. And then there are the incorruptibles, saints whose bodies, centuries after death, remain mysteriously untouched by decay. Saint Bernadette lies in Nevers, France. Dead since 1879, her body looks peaceful, almost sleeping. Pilgrims kneel at her glass tomb in awe. Scientists note that wax masks may have helped preserve the look. Each bone a story, each story a bridge between heaven and earth. And perhaps the strangest of all, the Capuchin crypt in Rome. Here, beneath a simple church, the bones of over 4,000 friars are arranged into delicate patterns. Chandeliers of vertebrae, altars of skulls. Not to frighten, but to remind. What you are now, we once were. What we are now, you shall be. So as you drift now, through dreams of dim crypts and marble corridors, let the silence of the saints lull you. The Church, ever mysterious, keeps its bones close, and its secrets even closer. You may imagine the Pope always seated upon a throne, surrounded by incense and cardinals in crimson. But history, drowsy though it may be, remembers other moments, moments of panic, of politics, of popes in disguise. Yes, there were popes who fled, popes who vanished, popes who put on the garments of beggars, monks, even women to escape the storm. Let us uncover these curious cloaked stories. We begin with Pope Benedict IX, one of the most scandalous pontiffs in history. Elected not once, but 3 times. He first took the papal throne in his 20s. He was accused of immorality, violence, even sorcery. Eventually, he sold the papacy to his godfather, Pope Gregory VI, for a hefty sum. But he later returned, tried to reclaim the papal throne, and was driven out once again. During these turbulent years, Benedict was said to roam the countryside in disguise, hiding from assassins and rival claimants. And then we find Pope John the 23, not the 20th century saintly one, but an earlier anti-pope from the 15th century. When political tides turned against him during the Council of Constance, he feared imprisonment or worse. So one night, under the cover of darkness, he escaped the city dressed as a servant, slipping past guards and vanishing into the Black Forest. They eventually caught him, but not before he gave Europe a tale of papal vanishing worthy of legend. Not all such disguises were dramatic. Sometimes the robes of humility served as cover. Pope Pius VII, held prisoner by Napoleon Bonaparte, traveled under false names while being shuffled from fortress to fortress across Europe. He was guarded, yes, but to many along the road he was just a quiet, elderly monk in a carriage. Yet within him sat the authority of Peter. And consider the popes of the Avignon papacy, who lived in France for nearly 70 years instead of Rome. When the time came to return to the Eternal City, danger lurked everywhere. Riots, plague, angry nobles. Popes and their envoys dressed as pilgrims rode through back roads and entered Rome secretly, under cloak and candlelight. The keys of St. Peter hidden beneath dusty traveling cloaks. But perhaps the most whispered tale is that of Pope Joan. Legend speaks of a brilliant woman, disguised as a man, who rose through the church ranks and became pope in the 9th century. She ruled for 2 years, according to the story, until she gave birth during a papal procession. The church, if this tale were true, covered it up. Some say a special papal chair with a hole beneath was introduced to test future popes' gender. Most scholars now believe the story is fiction, but it lingered for centuries, told in hushed tones and medieval manuscripts, because sometimes a story speaks to truths deeper than facts. Even into modern times, the Vatican has held to secrecy. Popes have escaped not only physical danger. Pope Celestine V, overwhelmed by the burdens of office, resigned in 1294 after only 5 months. He donned the robes of a hermit and attempted to retreat into obscurity. But his successor, fearing the chaos of 2 popes, imprisoned him. He died in captivity, his cell now a lonely pilgrimage site. Disguised popes, runaway popes, reluctant popes. Not always the image painted in gilded frescoes, but real, human, trembling beneath heavy robes. They remind us that even the Vicar of Christ sometimes wished to disappear. And now, as sleep tugs gently at your eyelids, let us wander into a different chamber of church history. One where the devil was not only cast out, but sometimes welcomed in. Not all wars of the church were fought with armies or papal bulls. Some were fought in silence, in candlelit rooms, in whispers. Some battles were fought against demons. For centuries, the Vatican has both acknowledged and quietly managed the strange affliction of possession. And to combat it, it trained a select few, the exorcists. But what did this mean within the gilded corridors of the papacy? What happened when demons came knocking at the Vatican gates? Let us go back to the 16th century, when the world was turning upside down. The Reformation was dividing the church. Science was questioning ancient dogmas, and yet, beneath it all, there was a rise in demonic possession. Nuns began convulsing in convents. Peasants howled in Latin they had never learned. Children cried out that the devil sat upon the altar. One of the most infamous cases was that of Loudun, France, where an entire convent of Ursuline nuns claimed possession, centered around one charismatic priest. Though far from Rome, this sent shockwaves to the papal ears. Was it hysteria, heresy, or real spiritual warfare? The popes responded not with swords, but with silence and structure. By the 17th century, the church had formalized the Ritual Romanum, a specific guide for exorcism. and in the Vatican itself a few trusted priests were always on hand, ready to perform the rite should it ever be needed, even for cardinals, or worse, popes. There are rumors, never confirmed, that at least 2 popes in history requested exorcisms be performed upon themselves, not because they were possessed, but because they feared temptation, influence, perhaps from forces beyond human. But sometimes the danger was closer. In 1837, a young seminarian in Rome was said to have been violently affected after claiming a demonic vision in St. Peter's Basilica. Witnesses said he screamed, "Non serviam," Latin for, "I will not serve," the legendary words of Lucifer, before collapsing. The Vatican investigated quietly. The man was removed. No record remains in official archives, but word spread, as it always does in the marble halls. Fast forward now to the 20th century. Pope Pius XII, during World War II, was rumored to have called for multiple exorcisms, not only for individuals, but for entire cities. He feared demonic influence in Berlin, in Moscow, in fascist Rome itself. Did he truly believe evil spirits had taken hold of governments? Perhaps. Perhaps not. But he authorized the Vatican's chief exorcist, Father Gabriele Amorth, to begin quiet investigations into political leaders and cult movements. Father Amorth would later perform over 70,000 exorcisms and claimed that Satan was indeed in the Vatican. Even Pope John Paul II, canonized as a saint, was not removed from these shadows. A woman screamed and convulsed during an audience. The Pope made the sign of the cross. She calmed. He was seen praying for her long after the crowd dispersed. No official statement followed, but the moment was captured on a single Vatican security tape, later locked away. And so, we are left wondering. How many whispers behind the Vatican walls are not of policy, but of possession? How many popes, in private chapel, whispered not prayers of power, but of protection? As the candles flicker low and incense drifts like mist, remember that some of the Church's most secret struggles were not with kings, but with shadows. And what then of holy relics said to guard against such evil? Objects so sacred, their very presence was believed to send demons fleeing. Deep within the stone heart of the Vatican lie objects that once touched saints, apostles, even Christ himself, or so the stories claim. Some are locked in glass, some in gold, some in silence. These are the relics, fragments of the sacred past, gathered, guarded, and often used as spiritual weapons in the Catholic Church's strange and winding history. But what exactly makes a relic so powerful, and what role have they played in the lives and secrets of the popes? Relics come in 3 classes. First-class relics are physical remains, bones, hair, or blood of a saint. Second-class relics are items they used, like robes, books, or even walking sticks. Third-class relics are items touched to a first-class relic, absorbing by contact some sense of the sacred. The popes, as the shepherds of the Church, have long held the most important relics in their possession. Some too important to display, others too strange to explain. Let us begin with perhaps the most famous, the relics of St. Peter. Beneath the high altar of St. Peter's Basilica, directly below the massive dome, is a quiet crypt, and within it lies a bone box labeled Petros Ini in Greek. Peter is here. Discovered in 1950, during secret excavations ordered by Pope Pius XII, the bones were tested, debated, and eventually declared likely authentic. Imagine the Pope saying Mass above the very bones of the first Pope. Then there are blood relics. One of the most venerated is the preserved blood of Pope John Paul II. Shortly after his death in 2005, vials of his blood were sealed and distributed to churches worldwide. In Krakow, one vial reportedly liquefied during a Mass. Others claim miraculous healings after touching it. Skeptics raise eyebrows, but the faithful queue for hours. And stranger still, the veil of Veronica, said to bear the miraculous image of Christ's face, imprinted as he walked to Golgotha. The relic has been kept in St. Peter's Basilica, behind 7 locked gates, shown only once a year during Lent. Popes have fasted before it. Some whispered prayers before major decisions. Others wept in its presence. Only a handful of people alive have seen it up close. Even fewer have spoken of what they felt. But not all relics are soothing. Some were seen as protection against darkness. In the private chapel of several popes were kept splinters of the true cross, locked in ornate reliquaries. When spiritual threats were whispered, be it demonic, political, or something unnamed, popes would call upon these relics during midnight rites. Whispers tell of Pope Leo XIII, who after receiving a disturbing vision of a dark century ahead, composed the Prayer to Saint Michael and kept a small relic of the archangel's sword by his bedside. No such relic exists in public record, but Then there are the relics of the Virgin Mary, her hair, her veil, even drops of her milk, all claimed by different churches. Most have no scientific basis, but to the medieval mind and to the papal heart, they represented a link to heaven. They were carried into battle, placed on sickbeds, held in trembling hands as the popes faced plague, schism, and fear. Even today, when a new pope is elected, relics are part of the ceremony. A fragment of St. Peter's bone is placed in his ring. He is reminded, "You are dust, and to dust you shall return." And so the Church, ever anchored in the sacred past, continues to walk forward, each step echoing with the weight of bones, blood, and belief. And now, as your eyes begin to close and your breath slows, we drift toward a stranger gallery still, for what happens when the Pope becomes... We often imagine popes as protectors of faith, steady, unwavering, and holy, but the corridors of history are not so straight. They twist, they shadow, and sometimes they lead straight into heresy. Yes, even the Vicar of Christ, the Holy Father himself, has at times been accused of defying the very faith he was sworn to uphold. And when a pope strays, who dares to correct him? Let us begin gently with Pope Honorius I. He reigned in the 7th century, a quiet man, thoughtful, but his error was one of silence. A theological dispute had risen. Did Christ have one will or two? Honorius tried to settle the matter diplomatically, suggesting a compromise. But centuries later, his writings were condemned by a church council. He wasn't declared evil, just wrong. And that was enough for future popes to whisper his name with unease. But there were louder storms ahead. Enter Pope John the 22nd in the 14th century. A brilliant man, scholarly, but his sermons began to drift into dangerous waters. He taught that the souls of the dead did not see God immediately, but had to wait until the final judgment. This went against centuries of Catholic teaching. Outcry grew. Cardinals panicked. Theologians demanded a retraction. John refused. Only on his deathbed did he whisper a soft recantation. But the scandal remained. A pope had preached heresy from the pulpit. And what of Pope Formosus? A strange tale indeed. He died peacefully in 896. But his enemies, now in power, were not satisfied. They dug up his corpse, months later, and held a trial. Yes, a trial for a dead pope. This became known as the Cadaver Synod. Dressed in papal robes, his rotting bonne was placed on the throne. A deacon was assigned to speak for him. The verdict, guilty of perjury, ambition, and heresy. They stripped his corpse, cut off his fingers, and threw him in the Tiber. A grotesque ritual of vengeance, yet one that highlighted the deep fear of heresy within the church. Even death was not an escape. And then, there was Pope Sergius III. His crimes were not of doctrine, but of blood. He rose to power through murder, ordered the killing of rivals, took a mistress, Marozia, and fathered a son who would become Pope John XI. And yet, Even surrounded by sin, Sergius was never officially declared a heretic. Why? Because in the strange language of the Church, heresy is not always about sin, but belief. You could kill, you could steal, but if you believed the right things, technically, you were no heretic. A troubling paradox that echoed through the centuries. Still, the line between heresy and orthodoxy was often drawn by power, not truth, even as he exchanged the papal throne like a chess piece, once for gold, another time simply out of boredom. But perhaps the most dangerous heresy of all was one never spoken, but only feared, that a pope might begin to believe he was divine, above correction, beyond truth. Some theologians whispered this was the true Antichrist, not a beast or a king, but a pope who no longer served God but himself. Thankfully, such a pope has never fully risen, but the fear remains. Quiet, watchful, and so we drift onward, past the heretics, the sinners, the mistaken, into a stranger, softer story. For the next chapter is not of sin or doctrine, but of visions. When the popes did not preach but saw, not all scandals are of flesh or fire. Some, curiously, are silent, born not in the daylight of sin, but in the strange twilight of dreams. There have been popes, not many, but more than you'd think, who claim to hear God's voice in their sleep, to see the Virgin Mary, angels, or even terrifying demons in their chambers. And from these dreams, decisions were made. Wars were blessed. Kings were crowned, doctrines born. But were they dreams or delusions? Let us lie back in the candlelit darkness of the Vatican Library and open the pages to Pope Innocent III. He ruled during the peak of papal power, a colossus, but he was deeply troubled by dreams. One in particular haunted him. He saw the Church of Rome crumbling, pillars collapsing, dust in the air. And then, young Francis of Assisi appeared, his arms outstretched, holding up the very walls. Innocent awoke, shaken. He summoned the barefoot friar he had once dismissed, and just like that, the Franciscan order was born, based on the dream of a pope. It reshaped Catholicism forever. But not all visions were so divine. Pope Boniface VIII, arrogant, flamboyant, claimed mystical encounters with saints, but also nightmares. He saw shadows rising from the crypts beneath the Lateran. He heard whispers accusing him of pride, blasphemy, and doom. One night, after a vivid hallucination, he ordered every mirror in the palace removed. He feared what stared back. His reign ended in disgrace, captured, mocked, and likely murdered. Some say he died mad, but perhaps it was only the dreams that grew too loud. Others found peace in visions. Pope Gregory IX, who canonized St. Francis, claimed that angels stood at his bedside. They recited prayers with him. They warned him of dangers in Rome and advised him on whom to trust. His court dismissed it as superstition, but Gregory listened and lived longer than many of his enemies. There is a softer story in Pope Celestine V, a hermit, dragged from his cave and crowned against his will. He spoke little, slept often, but in his dreams he saw Christ, weeping for the church, for the power games, for the throne of Peter. After only 5 months, Celestine did what no pope had done before. He resigned. He left the Vatican in the middle of the night in robes too large for his frail shoulders. He returned to the mountains. His visions had led him away from power, and for that some called him mad, others a saint. Even in recent times, the dreaming did not stop. Pope Pius X, in the early 20th century, confessed to a recurring dream, that one day a pope would flee Rome, stepping over corpses, hiding from enemies, carrying nothing but the calmer, or more afraid, or more convinced of their own divine mission. We will never know what they saw, but perhaps, in the silence of their chambers, behind ancient doors, in the moments before dawn. Heaven whispered, or perhaps hell did. And now, dear listener, as our own eyes begin to grow heavy, let us step away from the visions and into the earthly silence of forgotten stone. Not all scandals are of flesh or fire. Some, curiously, are silent, born not in the daylight of sin, but in the strange twilight of dreams. There have been popes, not many, but more than you'd think, who claim to hear God's voice in their sleep, to see the Virgin Mary, angels, or even terrifying demons in their chambers. And from these dreams, decisions were made. Wars were blessed, kings were crowned, doctrines born. But were they dreams or delusions? Let us lie back in the candlelit darkness of the Vatican Library and open the pages to Pope Innocent III. He ruled during the peak of papal power, a colossus, but he was deeply troubled by dreams. One in particular haunted him. He saw the Church of Rome crumbling, pillars collapsing, dust in the air. And then, young Francis of Assisi appeared, his arms outstretched, holding up the very walls. Innocent awoke, shaken. He summoned the barefoot friar he had once dismissed, and just like that, the Franciscan order was born, based on the dream of a pope. It reshaped Catholicism forever. But not all visions were so divine. Pope Boniface VIII, arrogant, flamboyant, claimed mystical encounters with saints, but also nightmares. He saw shadows rising from the crypts beneath the Lateran. He heard whispers accusing him of pride, blasphemy, and doom. One night, after a vivid hallucination, he ordered every mirror in the palace removed. He feared what stared back. His reign ended in disgrace, captured, mocked, and likely murdered. Some say he died mad, but perhaps it was only the dreams that grew too loud. Others found peace in visions. Pope Gregory IX, who canonized St. Francis, claimed that angels stood at his bedside. They recited prayers with him. They warned him of dangers in Rome and advised him on whom to trust. His court dismissed it as superstition, but Gregory listened and lived longer than many of his enemies. There is a softer story in Pope Celestine V, a hermit, dragged from his cave and crowned against his will. He spoke little, slept often, but in his dreams he saw Christ, weeping for the church, for the power games, for the throne of Peter. After only 5 months, Celestine did what no pope had done before. He resigned. He left the Vatican in the middle of the night in robes too large for his frail shoulders. He returned to the mountains. His visions had led him away from power, and for that some called him mad, others a saint. Even in recent times, the dreaming did not stop. Pope Pius X, in the early 20th century, confessed to a recurring dream, that one day a pope would flee Rome, stepping over corpses, hiding from enemies, carrying nothing but the calmer, or more afraid, or more convinced of their own divine mission. We will never know what they saw, but perhaps, in the silence of their chambers, behind ancient doors, in the moments before dawn, heaven whispered, or perhaps hell did. And now, dear listener, as our own eyes begin to grow heavy, let us step away from the visions and into the earthly silence of forgotten stone. Beneath the glory of St. Peter's Basilica lies another world, dark, cool, silent. Few have seen it, fewer understand it, but for centuries, this underground maze, known simply as the Vatican Necropolis, has whispered secrets to those who walk slowly enough to hear them. Here in the shadow of the papal throne, the dead sleep, and not just the dead but saints, martyrs, popes, and some say, things that are neither. Our story begins with St. Peter himself, the apostle, the rock, the first pope. According to tradition, he was crucified upside down on Vatican Hill, then buried in a quiet grave nearby. For centuries, his tomb was lost, buried under layers of altars, churches, and imperial architecture, until the 1940s. As part of an excavation requested by Pope Pius XII, Vatican workers unearthed a crypt beneath the basilica. Stone by stone, they uncovered a first-century cemetery, filled with pagan and Christian graves alike, and in its center, a small niche, covered in red wall markings, Greek letters spelling out, "Peter is here." Bones were found nearby. Male, elderly, missing the feet, possibly removed after crucifixion. Were they really Peter's? The Vatican says yes, but the mystery lingers, quietly, like a breath on cold marble. That was only the beginning. Dozens of other popes were buried in hidden chapels below the Vatican. Many remain unidentified. Some were buried hurriedly during times of chaos. Others were exhumed and reburied multiple times, victims of shifting politics and rival factions. Beneath the chapel of St. Sebastian lie popes martyred in early Roman persecutions. Their tombs are marked with ancient symbols: a fish, a cross, a palm branch. But some markers are scratched out. Why? Did someone try to erase their names from history? Or were these popes considered heretical by their successors? No one knows. Then there are the unofficial tombs. In 1969, workers restoring a side chamber discovered a sealed stone sarcophagus. Inside, the remains of a noblewoman, buried with silk robes and gold crosses. No records mention her. She may have been a secret sponsor of the church, hidden during a time when Christians were hunted. Or perhaps a forgotten saint. To this day, she has no name. And finally, there are rumors. Whispers among Vatican guards and clergy of a chamber deeper still, beneath even the necropolis. A place called the Libreria Mortuorum, the Library of the Dead. A room filled with bones, scrolls, and forbidden texts. Some say it was sealed centuries ago, its contents too dangerous for even the church to know. Others believe it never existed. But a few... Now, dear listener, our journey nears its end. But before we part, one more chapter remains. A chapter not of popes or bones or heresies, but of the weapons the church once wielded in the dark. The church has always been a spiritual force, but it was not always peaceful. At the crossroads of belief and fear, the medieval church once kept objects of power, tools of mystery, miracle, and, some whispered, dark enchantment. Relics that healed, relics that cursed, and some that were too dangerous to be seen. Tonight we walk the vaulted halls of these secret reliquaries, places where the divine and the dreadful met. Let us begin with chains of St. Peter. Held today in the San Pietro in Vincoli, these chains were said to be the very ones used to imprison Peter before his martyrdom. When Pope Leo I held them against the chains from Peter's Roman imprisonment, legend says they fused together, as if to confirm their holiness. But medieval priests believed the chains could bind demons as well. They were paraded through plague-struck towns, held over the sick, and even invoked during exorcisms. In the wrong hands, it was feared. They could also summon the very things they held at bay. Then came the lance of Longinus, the spear that pierced Christ's side. Several true lances circulated in Europe, but the one housed in Rome was said to grant invincibility to its holder. It was guarded jealously. Medieval emperors, including Charlemagne and Frederick Barbarossa, fought to possess it. Rumors spread that it had been hidden beneath St. Peter's Basilica, sealed behind marble and watched by silent monks. One tale tells of a pope who attempted to use the lance to bless a crusade. The next morning he was found unmoving, kneeling before the reliquary. His skin was cold, his heart still. There was also the veil of Veronica, believed to bear the face of Christ. In quiet Vatican vaults, monks claimed it wept blood during times of great crisis. Others said those who gazed too long at the face went mad, whispering unknown tongues. Pilgrims once traveled for months to glimpse it, but now it is rarely seen. Some say the church hides it because its power still lingers. But stranger still were the forbidden reliquaries, items locked away, too dangerous to destroy, too sacred to ignore. A shard of wood from the true cross, blackened by fire, said to emit smoke in the presence of liars. A silver box containing a finger bone of St. Thomas. If shaken, it is said to rattle, though no one dares open it. A glass vial labeled Tears of Judas. Even the popes, it is whispered, fear what lies in these sealed chambers. Only the Camerlengo, the papal chamberlain, holds the key, and he, by tradition, passes it on only at midnight, in silence. The Church, of course, never admits to such relics. They are lost, destroyed, misunderstood, but records in the Vatican secret archives, long hidden from public view, reference them plainly. Some are marked with red wax. Some pages are torn out entirely. Touch not what glows in darkness. It is not for the living to hear the weeping stone. Cryptic, chilling, but unmistakable. So as you drift further into the embrace of night, dear listener, imagine the stone vaults below Rome, the air cool, the shadows thick, and among them, chained, wrapped, sealed, rest the forgotten weapons of a holy empire. Not all tools of faith were made for peace. Some were forged in fear. And now they sleep, as do we. But one final chapter remains in the heart of the church, where power wore robes of silk and spoke in Latin whispers. Not all popes were who they claimed to be. Some ruled from the throne of St. Peter and never existed at all. Let us descend now, not into catacombs, but into the shadows of deception and desire. This is the tale of the Pope who never was. Our story begins not in Rome, but in the forgotten corners of the 10th century, during a time the Church would later call the Dark Century. Records from this era are fragmented, mysterious, and often contradictory. Popes rose and fell in rapid succession. Some reigned for days, others vanished overnight, and amidst this chaos came whispers of a woman in the robes of Peter. Her name? Pope Joan. According to the legend, Joan was a brilliant scholar who disguised herself as a man and rose through church ranks. As John Anglicus, she was elected pope, highly respected for her intellect and piety, but her secret unraveled in the most dramatic fashion. One day, during a procession between the Colosseum and the Lateran, she gave birth in the street, exposing her identity before the stunned cardinals and crowd. Some say she was stoned to death on the spot. Others claim she was quietly imprisoned and her name erased from all church records. For centuries, a strange ritual was said to follow every new pope's election. A cardinal would examine the pope seated on a special chair with a hole in the seat, declaring, "Duos habet et bene pendentes." He has 2 testicles, and they hang well. Was it simply tradition, or a cautious check for another Pope Joan? The Vatican denies her existence, but old statues, dusty manuscripts, and travelers' tales suggest otherwise. Joan was not the only pretender. In the 13th century, a man named Pierre Leone claimed the papacy as Anacletus II, supported by a powerful Roman family. His rival, Pope Innocent II, called him an anti-pope. But for 8 years, Anacletus ruled Rome, consecrating bishops, issuing bulls, and even crowning a king. To the people, he was the real pope. Only after his death was his reign erased, his name removed from church records, his supporters excommunicated. Was he a heretic? Or simply the wrong winner in a political chess match? Even stranger was the case of Pope Sylvester III. Elected in 1045, he was removed after a few months and declared an anti-pope. Yet for generations, church documents included his name in official papal lists before crossing it out in later editions. No one is sure what he did or why he fell, only that he ruled, briefly, and then didn't. A pope for a moment, then a ghost. And then, dear listener, we come to the deepest mystery. a nameless pope. In an obscure 14th century chronicle, an entry appears between two. Some historians believe it refers to a cardinal who seized power for mere hours, perhaps even minutes, before being quietly poisoned. Others think it's a cipher, a hidden message from within the Vatican itself. What happened during those missing hours? Who sat in the papal chamber? And why was he erased? We may never know. The Church, in all its grandeur, also carries with it the weight of forgotten faces. Some never canonized, some never buried, some never even named. And so tonight we light a candle not for the saints, but for the shadows. The papal masks, the false crowns, and the truths we are never meant to know. Imagine a hallway so old that the mortar between its stones has turned to dust. Imagine keys so ancient that their locks have not turned in centuries. Now imagine that behind one of those doors lies a secret so delicate, so dangerous, that even popes are advised never to read it. This is not fiction. This is the Vatican Apostolic Archive, once known as the Vatican Secret Archive. For centuries, this mysterious collection was the most restricted library in the world. Founded in the 17th century by Pope Paul V, it houses over 53 miles of shelves. On them rest papal bulls, royal letters, heresy trials, death warrants, spy reports, and documents so rare that only a handful of scholars have ever glimpsed them. What's inside? No one knows everything, but the whispers are many. One such whisper speaks of a letter from Lucifer himself, allegedly penned in the hand of a possessed nun in 1676. The letter, scrawled in strange symbols and reversed Latin, was said to be impossible to translate for centuries. Some believe it still lies in a locked drawer within the archive, its parchment too cursed to touch, its meaning too dangerous to reveal. Others scoff, but in the silence of those marble halls, even the skeptics walk softly. Another tale tells of the Malachi prophecy, a list of popes allegedly predicted by a 12th century Irish monk. The last pope on the list is described as Peter the Roman, who would guide the church through destruction and tribulation. Coincidence or not, Pope Francis is believed by some to be the final pope on that list. The prophecy itself, whether hoax or divine vision, is said to be stored in the archive, under restricted status. No photos, no copies, just dust, silence, and secrets. And then there are the records of the trial of the Templars. When the Knights Templar were accused of heresy and blasphemy in the early 1300s, the Vatican held the only full transcript of their trial, hidden for centuries. In 2007, parts of it were finally released to the public. What they revealed was shocking. The Templars had been absolved of heresy by the Pope himself. The Church had known the truth and kept it hidden for 700 years. What else lies sealed in those vaults? Did Judas leave a final testimony? Did Constantine's true vision differ from what the Church teaches? Was there ever a second, secret Christ? These are not questions the Vatican answers. These are questions the walls whisper. One Vatican corridor, blocked off to this day, is said to lead to the chronovisor, a mythical device claimed by a 20th century Benedictine priest. This device, Father Pellegrino Ernetti claimed, could see into the past, allowing its user to witness the crucifixion of Christ or hear Socrates speak. Ernetti died surrounded by secrecy. The Vatican denies the chronovisor ever existed. But somewhere, behind layers, in the end, the Vatican is not just the seat of faith. It is a cathedral of memory, a palace of shadows, and a fortress of forgotten time. What it guards may not be evil, but it is powerful. Too powerful, perhaps, for the waking world, and so it sleeps beneath stone, key, and silence until someone dares to knock. And now, dear traveler, you've reached the end of our sleepy descent. If your eyes are heavy, let them close, and if your mind still stirs, remember, not all truths are lost. Some are simply unwelcome. Comes the villain of the story.